Good evening, all. Tonight, we are coming back to ethics to talk about our two utilitarian thinkers, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. So let's start with Bentham. Bentham's summative quotation is kind of interesting. The principle of utility approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever, emphasis my own, according to the tendency which it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question. So he's basically saying, under no uncertain terms, that anything goes provided it makes you happy. Now, Bentham was kind of an interesting guy. One of the founders of utilitarianism, of course, which is a consequentialist theory, is exactly what it sounds like, that the moral value of an action is entirely a function of its consequences. Psychologically and ethically, he was a hedonist, which meant he believed that the best indicator of something's ethicality was, does it make you happy? He was known in his own day as a social reformer, philosophical radical, a political liberal, was influential in the Reform Bill of 1832. And a couple of years ago, they did a psychobiographical study of him that suggests that he probably had Asperger's syndrome, which may tell us a little bit about why he was so focused in on mathematical expressions of ethics. So according to Bentham, all human action, and he's not kidding, he means every single thing you do, from the biggest thing to the smallest thing, is motivated either directly or indirectly by a desire for pleasure. That pleasure is the sole good, and all other things are good, if they're good, only as a means to some particular pleasure that we can get. Now, one of the strange features of this is that he felt that all pleasures are qualitatively the same and of equal value. The only difference is quantity. So if you've got one Mona Lisa and a series of 3 dogs playing poker, the dogs win. If you've got a stack of kind of marginal Big Macs and you've got a beautiful filet mignon cooked perfectly medium rare, the Big Macs sadly win. If 2 experiences contain equal amount of pleasure, no matter what other differences might obtain between them, neither is better or worse than the other. It was all a numbers game for Bentham. So his main key concept is utility. This is the tendency to increase the happiness of the individual something affects. General utility is extending that to all people whom it affects. The principal utility, or the greatest happiness principle, says basically an action is right and a policy is right to the extent it promotes the happiness of the individuals affected. Now, Bentham's main goal in this was to create what he called a pannomion. Pan means all, nomos means law. Pardon me. So a complete utilitarian code of law. And he had a point, because England in Bentham's day had laws that were pre-Magna Carta, that were predated William of Normandy, that predated Alfred the Great. So this is going back to like 9th century. Some of them were a little odd. I'll leave you to research that on Google on your own. But utilitarianism is really kind of interested in this, and in specifically the greatest happiness principle, and he has a point. Here's what Bentham says. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of 2 sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It's for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong, on the other, a chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Now, he's not transparently wrong about this, is a lot of what we do, either directly or indirectly, does involve considerations of pain or pleasure. So the principles of legislation basically is going to call good everything that produces the greatest amount of pleasure and the minimum amount of pain, and evil is whatever produces the most pain without adequately compensating us with some sort of pleasure. Okay, now this pleasure could be physical, could be spiritual, could be moral, intellectual, emotional. And he says this only really works in a civilized society, but he's going to set down a criteria for measuring the extent of pleasure or pain that a decision might create. And he calls it his hedonic calculus, sometimes also called the utility calculus, the philosophic calculus, the hedonistic calculus. Those are quiz questions. The hedonic calculus is an algorithm. Now, before your brain shuts down because of mathy language, don't let it. An algorithm is just a formula for something, okay? How to calculate the degree of pleasure. So as an ethical hedonist, he believes the moral rightness or wrongness is tied to that whole pleasure or pain thing. So here's how he does it. He's got a bunch of variables. He called them elements or dimensions, but there's 7 of them. And here they are. Intensity. How strong is the pleasure? Is it like a rack your whole being thing, or is it just kind of a, that's nice? Duration. How long does it last? Several seconds, several minutes for the rest of your life. Certainty. How likely or unlikely is it that the pleasure is going to occur? Like, do we have any guarantees here? Propinquity, which is just fun to say. How soon is it going to occur? We might call this remoteness if we wanted a little more modern term. Fecundity, which is a term we borrow over from the biological sciences, which usually refers to sexual reproduction. In this context, just means reproduction. How soon after we have that can we get similar experiences again, or will it never be the same again? Purity. How probable is it that we won't have pain following our pleasure? And then extent. How many people are affected? Is this just me? Is it me and one other person? Is it all of us? What are we looking at here? So basically, we're going to pick one these and take an account. Which pleasures do we have? Which pains? And then the following pleasures, the following pains. He basically wants us to make a T-chart. You know, pleasures on this side, pains on this side, the ayes have it, or the nays. Okay, we're going to sum all these up. We're going to take an account of this, and we're going to take the balance whichever side it's on. So we get out our little Big Chief tablet, our number 2 pencil, and we start jotting down figures. And he's not kidding. Like, this isn't just a thought exercise. He really wants you to do this. Now, what if it involves you and one other person? Well, now you got to do it for them too. What if it's for a whole group of us? Now we've got to do it for each and every one of us, and we've got to average it out and see whether it's more pleasurable or more painful. Now, to make this even easier to remember, he composes what he calls his mnemonic doggerel, sometimes called the Memorder verses. And here it goes. Intense, long, certain, speedy, fruitful, pure, such marks in pleasures and in pains endure. Such pleasures seek if private be thy end. If it be public, wide let them extend. Such pains avoid whichever be thy view. If pains must come, let them extend to few. Thank you very much. Now, as weird as all this seems, I mean, it seemed weird when Kant was asking us to gauge everything by whether our maxim could be made a universal law. Now Bentham wants us, reciting poetry and doing math problems. Bentham actually has come to some use. So for instance, Bentham argued that some punishments are worse than the crime, or worse off, some criminals become worse while being punished for their crime. So you get someone goes to jail for a relatively minor offense, has to toughen up in order to survive, and comes out a hardened criminal where they wouldn't have been before. And so he says, but this whole kind of pain and pleasure thing really has a lot of applications here. Now, criticisms of Bentham are really pretty obvious. One would be that it lacks a principle of fairness, or does it? So Bentham says we should act so the greatest number of people are happy. So that implies a majority, which in turn implies a minority, whomever it may be. Now, we hear minority and we usually think along racial terms, sexual terms, gender terms, something like that, but it's not that same here. What we're talking about is if we got 10 people, all we got to do is please 6 of them. So those other 4 are left. Now, maybe it's, do we want pineapple or anchovies on our pizza? Hopefully not both. And how are we going to decide this? Well, the cool thing with Bentham is it's completely arbitrary. You might be the person who doesn't like that particular thing, but it's not singling you out because of it. Okay, so there is that. Now, Bentham in literature, if you read Oliver Twist, Charles Dickens, great book. This is going to have, Bentham has a lot of influence on Charles Dickens because basically it's a question of social welfare. Prior to the 1830s, you had a pretty stable local population in England, and they had what was called the parish system, where if you got sick, if you got hurt, if someone died, the parish, that is to say the local church, would come in and support you, widows and orphans, that kind of thing. With the Industrial Revolution, though, something changes. Now people are moving out from the countryside towards the major areas, Birmingham, London, wherever, okay? And so London's population doubles in about 10 years, and the old welfare system isn't going to work with this as people are moving. And so the whole idea with Bentham was that, well, humans seem to organize their lives according to pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain. If we make it painful enough to live on public charity, human beings would choose the less painful option of work and economic dependence as a means to pursue their pleasure. If we go to, again, Charles Dickens, in his Christmas Carol, we've got the two guys that visit Ebenezer Scrooge. And if you've never seen a Christmas Carol, you are remiss, you need to see a Christmas Carol. And Scrooge echoes Bentham right away. He says, "Oh, has the workhouse been abolished?" And they say, "Well, no." And he goes, "Well then, the poor don't need my help." Okay. So Bentham's kind of an interesting guy. One of the things that is kind of infamous about Bentham is he actually had his body dissected as part of a public anatomy lecture, and it was put on display first in the home of one of his students and later in University College London. So you can actually go there and you can see Jeremy Bentham's body if you are so inclined. So let's switch gears and talk about his student, John Stuart Mill, whose summative quotation is, "It's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." So John Stuart Mill was homeschooled by his father, James Mill, who was kind of this Anglo-centric imperialist author and kind of a jerk, really, an economist, and by Jeremy Bentham. So you can see why he turned out a little weird. His principle of utility is a take on Bentham's that adds, it's still greatest happiness principle, greatest happiness for the greatest number. Actions are right in proportion. He adds that very importantly, that they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they promote the reverse of happiness. And so there's an idea of the good. For Mill, the good is pleasure and freedom from pain. But this just gets it a little more complex, because now he says not only do we look at the quantity of pleasure, we have to look at the quality of pleasure also, and with priority. So he gets into a discussion of higher and lower pleasures. The higher pleasures are things that only we as rational animals can experience. So this would be enjoying our intellect, our imagination, moral sentiments, judgments, and so on. The lower pleasures are carnal pleasures of sensation. Good food, good drink, good sex, good exercise, good rest, and so on and so forth, that are available to all rational nature. Justice for Mill is again going to be a different definition from Hume, different definition from Hobbes, and so on. Justice is a set of rules that protect our essential interests. These are rules that we can demand, or rather rights, that we can demand society protects on our behalf. So don't let me be killed without cause. Don't let me be stolen from. Don't let me be lied to, and so on and so forth. Okay? Now, utilitarianism, Mill wrote prodigiously, and a lot of his other writing is very, very good. One of his books called On Liberty, you need to put it on your bucket list, read it before you die, you'll be better for having done so. Utilitarianism, this is really his only major discussion of this particular kind of ethics, and it was actually published in serial form in Fraser's magazine and then collected into a book which was revised a couple of times. And so he's going to go through things for our purposes like what utilitarianism is, what's the connection between justice and utility, and really what he's doing is he's defending utilitarianism against attacks of Immanuel Kant. Okay, so he's distinguishing two broad schools of ethical theory. The one whose principles are defended by appeals to intuition, like Hume, remember, our sympathy, and reason, like Kant. And on the other side, kind of weird that he puts Hume and Kant together, on the other side, those whose principles are defended by appeals to empirical experience. So Hume called himself an empiricist, but Mill says, no, he was doing intuitive stuff. He says utilitarianism is an empirical school of ethics. So Mill is interested in this greatest happiness principle, saying actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they promote the reverse of happiness. Kind of a nod to the Epicureans here, who said that the absence of pain was the best way to describe pleasure. And it's not necessarily our own greatest happiness that matters, but the greatest happiness altogether. So it's kind of a cumulative thing. We're all in this together. Utilitarianism only can get this goal of greater happiness by cultivating virtue in individuals, so we can all benefit from the honor of one another. Now, this is going to deal with doing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And that's that total sum happiness that we're really after. So what Mill is going to say is that to truly be happy, we have to turn our attention away from our own happiness towards other objects and ends, such as doing good for others, pleasures like art and music and literature and so on. And he says, if you don't like those things, well, you just haven't been in a position to appreciate them yet. In contrast with Bentham's idea that quantity of pleasure being equal, pushpin is as good as poetry, Basically, as long as the quantity is the same, if you like NASCAR better than opera, we better tear down all of the opera houses and put up NASCAR stadiums. Mill's argument is that, well, simple pleasures are preferred by people who just don't have experience with those higher pleasures, and therefore they're not in a position to judge. Mill, for instance, would have given extra voting power to university graduates. Now, before you think him too much of an elitist, and he was, it's not that he's undervaluing uneducated or undereducated people. He believed that it's the process of education, not the intrinsic nature of the educated, that qualifies them to have more influence in government. I mean, think of the process of education. Here you are listening to a lecture. I'm going on and on. Don't worry, we're about to wrap this up. But you have to have a fair amount of patience to devote to this kind of study. Mill thought that was worth something. I think he was probably right. According to Mill's qualitative account of happiness, humanity is this company of progressive beings, and we're developing and exercising our rational capacities. Because of this, he rejected censorship. He didn't want anything censored. He wanted you to read those banned books and decide for yourself. He rejected paternalism. Don't want to wear your seatbelt? Don't, but you're also responsible for the consequences of that. He wants you to develop and then exercise your deliberative, your choice making, and your rational capacities. Now he says, look, if you don't believe me, just look back at Aristotle. Mill said the proof of the principle of utility is that it's human nature. Aristotle said virtue is natural as the excellence, the audite of human function. But for Aristotle, virtues are a means to an end to achieve happiness. Virtues are chosen for the sake of happiness. According to Mill, that's kind of abstract. I mean, I don't say I am going to cultivate in myself justice so I can be happy. That'd be a little weird. It's an abstract philosophy. Mill wants concrete happiness. He wants people to know that they are actually happy. So the principle of utility says what's good is what's good because it brings about pleasure. What's bad is what brings about pain. And pleasure allows us to know what's best and good because it contributes to the greatest good for the greatest number. Every human being desires this pleasure because, well, we just kind of do. Because we have parts of happiness, happiness is complete. It's not abstract. Happiness remains abstract for Aristotle, according to Mill. No one's concrete happiness, so we can actually be happy now. Now, recall that according to some readings of Aristotle, specifically his Nicomachean Ethics, happiness was only possible in a complete life. And complete life could mean either that it's complete and lacking nothing, or that it's complete as in it's over. Mill wants us to be happy now while we're alive and we can enjoy it. And according to Mill, and I love the chutzpah of this statement, to borrow the Yiddish term, is the mistake of all other moral theories, including Aristotle's, is that they're really based on the principle of utility, but other moralists were simply blind to that fact. I love that. You've got to have you got to have some guts to claim that yours is the theory that all the others had, even if they didn't realize it or were too stupid to notice. So that is Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. That is as far as we are going for this evening. As always, if you have comments or questions, put them down in the comments or over in the discussion on Canvas, and I will look forward to seeing you again next week. Bye-bye.